Gena, would you like to introduce yourself? You're tuning in from LA, correct?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Sure, happy to share a little bit about myself. I'm from New York originally. I grew up in a small town in northern Westchester on the border of Connecticut and spent my childhood running around barefoot in the summers, immersed in nature. I thought I wanted to be a zoologist until I had to dissect a rat in AP Bio and realized that path was not for me. I ended up ultimately pursuing the law, given my passion for social justice. I was working at the ACLU at the time that I decided to go to law school. And I spent most of my career as a lawyer working for the Obama administration in a variety of roles where I served as the right hand to a principal. I worked as counselor to the general counsel of DHS. I worked at the White House for a bit on environmental and energy issues. And I ultimately left the administration to go to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and served as counsel to the director of the agency. And in all of those roles, I realized I had a passion for leadership development, for maximizing the potential of teams, maximizing the potential of people I was working with, and improving processes. And when Trump was elected, I found myself able to go anywhere and do anything. I was out of a job. And kind of out of the ashes of all of that, I decided to live out my dream of moving to California. And I chose LA to work for a clean tech startup as general counsel and chief of staff to the CEO. And I learned a ton. We were in a B raise at the time, and I was really involved with that process. I had my hands in everything. I was able to kind of experience an entrepreneurial existence vicariously. I had been obsessed with how I built this, and so it was great to be in that startup place. But after about a year, I was suffering through some burnout, and there were some other things going on that I decided to take that moment to live out a yearning to take a break from all things work related and pursue a travel sabbatical.
Cool. So do you remember why you first got the idea to do this? Had you seen folks that had done it before, or what gave you this idea in the first place?
Yeah, so I did semester at sea in college, and that was when my wanderlust was born. And ever since that experience, I've been obsessed with traveling. I feel like there's nothing like travel to expand our senses, to expand our experiences, to get us out of our routines and our norms. And I just feel like it blows us open to different things. So I'd always loved traveling. I had done some shorter stints. I traveled for 6 weeks before law school. I took a month off around that time that Trump was elected to get my bearings. And so it wasn't totally unfamiliar to me. I also, of course, had read Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. But this time felt different because it was the first time that I chose to take an extended trip on a one-way ticket without a robust plan, without a lot of structure to it, with no job. I just kind of took this flying leap into the unknown.
Yeah. What do you remember about semester at sea? I feel like studying abroad is a great kind of first sabbatical. I wish I would have done.
Yeah, it was incredible. So it was a cruise ship, and there were around, I believe, 500 passengers, students, professors. There were senior passengers who are my idols. They're senior citizens who are global travelers, and they joined us. And so it was this incredible community of people traveling the world together. We took courses on board about the culture, geography, history of every place we went. And then when we landed in a country, we typically had 2 to 5 days to just go off and pursue however we wanted to. And so there was so much freedom in it. And it was interesting. At some point on the cruise, on the semester at sea, when we had a core class where everyone was together, and they asked us if we thought the experience made the world seem bigger or smaller. And I felt like even though we had just traveled around the world and seen so much, I had experienced like the equivalent of a grain of sand on an entire beach. Like I felt like we barely scratched the surface. And so it kind of opened my eyes to the enormity of this planet. And the other incredible thing about semester at sea was the human connection, to meet people across so many different cultures and times and places and see commonalities. And in that way, it made the world seem a little smaller to me.
Yeah. What did it change your perspective on what you wanted to do afterwards?
In a way, I was a psychology major with women's studies, and if I had done semester at sea before college, I probably would have tried to pursue a path that was international focused. But I think that after that experience, I had this idea of trying to do something with an international nexus. play out.
Yeah. So tell us why you're here. Like, tell us why you've kind of taken this path to coach folks on sabbaticals, why your sabbatical is so meaningful to you.
When I was on my sabbatical, I was pretty lost in terms of my career. I had loved the experience in the Obama administration, and I knew I'm very mission oriented. And I felt like I hit the jackpot. It was such an honor and a privilege to work for the administration. And I got to work on so many different roles and excel. However, I had this nagging feeling like something was missing. And I internalized it and thought, what is wrong with me? Why am I not living my best life? I feel so fortunate what's going on here. And I kind of just pushed it away and didn't think much about it. And then when I went to the startup, I thought, well, maybe some of my discontent working in government was because of slow processes and lack of innovation and things like that. And now being in a startup, I'll be able to combine all my favorite things into one place and have this fabulous career experience. And there were things I loved about it, but I still felt like I wasn't fully utilizing my strengths, my gifts, the things that when you think about your work and what lights you up, there were certain things that really lit me up. And then there were some things that really weren't fulfilling for me. And so on that sabbatical, I wanted to try to figure out where I was going to go. And my gut instinct was do something totally different, but I felt like I didn't know where to start. So I enrolled in a coaching program through Martha Beck. At that time, I had seen her a couple workshops, and her teachings really resonate for me. And so the goal was to immerse myself in kind of like a boot camp to apply all the coaching techniques to myself to figure out where I wanted to go. And sometimes things are so obvious, it almost seems like they're in our blind spot, so close to us, we can't see them. But now in hindsight, it's so obvious that I would become a coach. But in that moment, I never in a million years thought I would become a coach. I didn't really know what coaching was. I guess I thought it was like I played soccer my whole life growing up, so I thought maybe it was like a coach for a team where they're like cheering you on. Also being a psych major, my mom's a clinical psychologist. I was just like, who are these life coaches? Why don't they get an MSW or a PhD? And I just didn't know what was going on. But what I did learn through the experience is that coaching is a way for someone to hold a mirror to your own strengths and gifts. It's a way a lot of us live in mental chatter to get stuff done, to-do list, strategy, logical thinking. It brings us a lot of success. However, when we're in that mode all the time, we lose sight a little bit of dropping down into more of like heart space, a spiritual space, our intuition. And what I learned through doing the coaching program and now serving as a coach is that we all have everything we need within us already. We have all of our answers. We have the ability to create a sense of calm and peace and fulfillment in us. And we're often taught to look external for those things. But that was the beauty of coaching for me, that through this coaching program, I came to understand my inner truth, which is that coaching is my greatest passion, and to give me the courage to face different fears and step into this chapter of coaching.
All right. Spoiler alert then. I guess that's the end of the conversation. Tell me about what changed within you to get you to that point. So obviously you had a certain definition of work and success, and the way you worked over time. Maybe what happened on the sabbatical, and then we can kind of unwind it a little bit.
Yeah. So one of the things that was huge that I took away from the sabbatical that I apply in coaching as well is I didn't know it was happening at the time, but I essentially restored the essence of who I am, because in all of my work life, I had been devoting so much of my time and energy to work. If you think of your life as a pie chart, it's, family and friends and obligations and work and other things. And ideally we would be on our own life pie chart. But I looked back on my recent years and thought, wow, I was barely on that pie chart. Like it was a lot of work focus. And by quitting my job and starting fresh, every day I spent doing things that lit me up. It wasn't even necessarily intentional. It was just I finally had the time and space to pursue these things I had yearned for. I literally had a to-do list that I'd been carrying with me for like a decade that said, work out, learn to dance, like all these things, Pete. And so I finally was able to do all of those things. And when you think of I think of us as mind, body, heart, soul. That's kind of a common framework to think of us. And what was happening through my sabbatical was that I was restoring those 4 pillars of who I am. On the mind piece, I was able to listen to podcasts and read books and just light up my intellectual curiosity. The body piece, I developed a love for running. I used to hate running, but when I was traveling, the sunrise was magical. I turned into a morning person somehow, and I would wake up at sunrise and go running, and it was so magical because it was just me and the runners and the dog walkers and the sights without tourists. And so that body piece is huge for me. And understanding that my body houses my mind and heart and soul, and that it's sacred, and just learning to treasure it in a way that I hadn't before. And in the heart space, as I said, I was a psych major. My mom's a clinical psychologist, and I've been in therapy for years, but it was the first time that I really stepped into honoring my full spectrum of emotions and sitting with things that were hard, and learning the power in our emotional space. We're often taught to push away certain emotions or see certain emotions as bad, but in that time of my sabbatical and in a lot of solitude that I found myself with, I was able to approach my full self with compassion. And then the spiritual piece is something I never thought I would be talking about those years that I was like buttoned up in suits at DHS. I didn't think much of spirituality or know what it was, but to me, spirituality it's the essence of who we are. It's those quiet times with loved ones, or when we're in nature, or when we're surrounded by the arts, or immersing ourselves in creativity, and we just feel our authentic self lit up, full of energy, radiant, and no mask, no pretenses, no ship shaving, no dimming our lights, just who we are. And I really stepped into that spiritual space through my sabbatical, listening to podcasts like Oprah Super Soul Sunday and On Being. And I just was like so obsessed with that too. So out of my sabbatical and learning to honor those four things, it's something I've carried with me in my personal life. And it's something I bring to coaching, and relatedly understanding that if you think of us as having like a tank of energy, that there are certain things that boost our energy, and we might feel like, oh, I don't have the energy to do those things. Like so many times we're like, oh God, I don't have the energy to go outside for a walk, but going outside for that walk will bring us energy. And similarly, there are things that really drain our energy, like those things we know, like social media, binging on TV, all these things, but those are the things sometimes we crave. And so I learned out of my sabbatical how to really boost my energy and be mindful and form habits around those things in my life, which is something I bring to coaching and still carry on in my life.
Yeah, so I want to dig into those a little bit. Speaking of Eat, Pray, Love, I think if it was titled Become a Morning Person and Run, I would not have read that book. What did you like? So what were your expectations going in? Like, you're like, I'm going to do these things, and here's how I want to arrive at the end of it. How did you plan that?
It's interesting. People who know me, I'm like a total researcher. And when I do trips, I have spreadsheets. I research everything. I mean, I typically have reservations at restaurants booked and like hotels booked, and I know where I'm going. But this trip, I just felt this strong sense of, I don't want anything planned out. I want this to unfold. And the interesting thing was, I have an identical twin sister, and she coincidentally found herself in a place of taking a travel sabbatical. And it's interesting because I think we both kind of had this experience of like, wait, but I was planning on doing a travel sabbatical, and like, I thought this was my thing. Like, we have our whole twin identity thing, but it turned out beautifully because we decided to travel together at times, and then we would go apart and do solo travel. So solo travel is really important to me. It's something I delved into later in life, and I think it is the most extraordinary thing. It's such a privilege to be able to experience traveling alone and carving out each day how you want it to be. So I didn't have a whole lot of expectations. I just knew that I wanted it to unfold. This is so cliche, but started in Paris. I was in Paris for 5 days alone, met up with my sister, and then we entered the French countryside, and we ended up kind of traveling pretty rapidly, around 2 nights per place all through France. And we ended up going through almost 10 countries in 10 weeks. Ultimately, the things that were important to me were that I wanted a break from work, and I didn't want to be focusing on a job search. And that was a challenge. We as humans like to cling to this illusion of control. And I really had those mechanisms in me wanting to have some sense of certainty that out of all of this, I'd have a job and a career that was fulfilling and it would all work out. But I try to, with compassion, quiet those voices and just allow this space with nothing work related. the interesting thing was that with the Eat, Pray, Love, in the end, she finds romantic love. And I joke that with my sabbatical, I came into true self-love and self-compassion, which I think is invaluable. And so that's probably some variation on the title for me.
And remind me and tell folks how you kind of came to it. So you had an idea that you weren't going to be looking for a job in the near future. Were you able to like set aside a period of time before you started looking?
Yeah. So one of the things, DJ, that you and I have talked about is unfortunately in our country, because a lot of companies don't pay for sabbaticals, it's something of a privilege to be able to take a sabbatical. And I had been saving for a long time. I had come off of working for the federal government, so I had modest savings, but I decided that I had enough to last 6 to 8 months approximately. And certainly some people go to Asia, they're frugal travelers, and in hindsight, maybe that would have been a good way to go. But I'm obsessed with Europe. My family's actually working on Italian citizenship, and I really wanted to go back to Europe. I didn't do that, the backpacking through Europe when you're in your 20s. And so I think that was really what my vision was for this. Was I had sufficient savings. I wanted to do a backpacking experience, and just trusting that in that 6 to 8 month mark, I'd make something happen for income.
And you left your laptop at home and kind of like, how'd you set the boundaries?
I had an iPad with me, but I set boundaries. There were a couple opportunities that dropped into my lap that I did end up pursuing, but I'm proud of myself for the most part. I wasn't searching. I wasn't expending energy in a job search or something related to my career. And so I guess, in a way, like I'm training now in IFS, which is internal family system. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a type of therapy, and I'm not a therapist, but I just like the teachings a lot. And the idea is we have these different parts within ourselves, and I do have this. I had this very like former perfectionist, former type A tendencies towards workaholic, identifying with the grind and the hustle and being busy. And one of the beautiful things that came out of my sabbatical was that I was able to see that those parts of my identity were no longer serving me. And I began to go through the slow process of shedding those things that no longer serve me. And that is, I think, many people who go through a sabbatical or any kind of transformative experience, we come to see these things that no longer serve us. And so it's kind of like a shedding and then also an excavating into our deeper truths at the same time.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, this strikes me as one of those things that folks I've known who've taken a sabbatical will say things like this. And then folks who are entering in a period of time off are like, I'm burnt out. I want to go see the world. Like, I'm not necessarily interested in shedding my ego. Like, how did that happen? And do you remember parts that helped it along, or what does that mean?
It was interesting. I felt almost like I was cheap. So I did ultimately come back to LA, and I worked on a consulting basis as a chief of staff to an early stage women's workwear startup. Incredible experience. It was a 3-month gig. And when that ended, I found myself at this other crossroads. Just a side note, I chose that opportunity because I am very creative. And one of the things I felt was missing in my prior career was creativity. So I thought, this is it. My whole life has led to this moment. I'll work for this startup. It's in the creative space. The sabbatical, this is where it led me to. But ultimately, I think our unfolding is our unfolding. Our path is our path. And whatever we choose, whatever decisions we make, we ultimately get to that place. And so at the end of this startup experience, I found myself in another crossroads. And that's when I decided to take my leap into coaching.
When you were on the sabbatical, what types of activities helped you kind of get there? You mentioned listening to podcasts, but obviously, like, you underwent a transformation, and you also, like, invested in your spiritual side, which you didn't even know was there, it sounds like.
Yeah. So when I restored myself, which I didn't know that was happening at the time, but now I see clearly that's what happened. It was kind of an inevitable process and an inevitable unfolding. So I decided to become a coach, and I had initially thought when I was interested in coaching, I thought maybe it would be more like a hobby where I'd get a couple clients, see how it goes, have a full-time job, and then build a little coaching business on the side. That was the practical thing. But instead, when I was at that crossroads, every fiber in my being was like, I can't go back to a traditional job. And I just took this leap. I didn't have a website. I didn't have any clients. I was like, I'm a coach. And what happened, which kind of relates to your last question too, was there was this, Martha Beck uses the metaphor of a caterpillar to a butterfly. I thought in some way a caterpillar cocoons itself and sprouts wings and like flies away. But what happens is the caterpillar fully dissolves and dies in the cocoon. But the fascinating thing is the caterpillar has the genetic makeup for the butterfly in it. So it has like DNA this for wings and DNA this for legs and antennae and whatever. So the caterpillar has the making for the butterfly, but it has to fully die before it becomes a butterfly. And that is kind of what happened to me. I decided to launch my coaching business. I was super excited about it. And yet I was having dreams that I was telling people I was a lawyer. And like, I was feeling really unsettled in if someone said, what do you do, for me to say, I'm a life and executive coach. Like saying you're a lawyer has this cachet, saying you work at the White House has this cachet, saying you're a life and executive coach, you maybe get like quizzical stares. Like, okay, what's going on with you? But that was kind of the journey for me, was sitting with that grief of shedding those parts of my identity. Like, I think I maybe would have thought that I did this travel sabbatical and I launched my new career and I changed my life and everything was fabulous. But there were definitely times within that stretch. I ended up, I think it was like 6 to 8 months total that I was not working. There were stretches where I had times that I was confused and scared and didn't feel great and felt blah. And I think that's all part of the journey, is as we grow into our metamorphosis, that there is a sense of grief of shedding that old identity, but trusting that out of it we'll fly into something better.
Yeah, I think the caterpillar dying is probably not the best story for kids. So that's new. That's news to me, though. So thank you for ruining that for me. You talked about spending the first part healing, and I think from the interviews and research that we've done, that feels like it's a really important piece. What did you do that healed and restored you? I talked to a lot of people that are like, I want to like climb this mountain. I want to do this yoga retreat. I want to like learn this language, which I think can be healing. But I'm curious as to what served that purpose to you.
Well, there were a number of things. So I've been working on and off with a therapist for years, and she's an IFS trained therapist, and it changed my life. So I was doing calls with her while I was abroad. I was doing the coaching program, which had such an incredible community, and I was learning all these fascinating tools to delve into my inner world. That mind, body, heart, soul piece was happening. I mean, for example, developing a love for running was huge for me, because I was an athlete growing up, although I may not have identified as that. But throughout my adult life, I worked out like once or twice a week. Like, I just didn't understand. And now I look back and think, how did I survive? Like, how did I not end up in a ditch somewhere not working out more regularly? That the working out really brought me amazing energy and health and well-being. And when I was working at the startup, I was eating like a power bar for lunch at my desk. Like, I just wasn't taking care of myself. And so one of the things that was cool, so on a personal note, I'm divorced, and that happened before, when Trump was elected. We actually signed our divorce papers like 2 days after the election. And my Instagram account is Moonlight's Musing, for the poem Barns Burnt Down, Now I Can See the Moon. But I mentioned that because out of that Phoenix Rising experience post-divorce, I went through this phase that people mentioned to me that sounded super cheesy, but it ended up being true, that I would end up dating myself. And when people told me that, I was like, whatever, I'm not doing that. Like, that sounds stupid. But again, it was one of those things, I didn't set out with an intention of dating myself, but that sabbatical in particular, I just was devoting so much time on me. I think as women and others in society, we have a badge of honor of serving others and meeting other people's needs. And I felt it was weird, because I was so there for everybody else. I felt sometimes like I was like a 7-Eleven for being there for other people emotionally. I didn't have great boundaries at that point in my life. But when it came to me and having needs, I felt needy, or like, God forbid I'd express something. And so out of my sabbatical and those few months that I was really focusing on these things, I learned to honor my own needs. I did date myself in, like, I'd go to fabulous dinners by myself. I did things that just felt like I was really tending to me. And so all of that together was really healing.
Yeah, the concept of dinners with yourself resonates with me. I think like growing up an only child and like seeing folks alone, you know, at the movies or at dinner always depressed me.
Yes.
And so then I
Yeah.
was extra self-conscious of that when I was on my sabbatical. And I remember a moment in Buenos Aires where I was like just having, you know, the biggest steak of my life. And I think I was reading some book that I was excited about, and there was all these families around me, and I just had this like empowered feeling of, man, I wonder if folks are like jealous of me because I look like I'm having a good time, like I am having a good time.
Yeah, it's so fast. I think a lot of us are led to believe that being single at a restaurant is like you're like a loser, you're alone. I mean, it's so messed up, the stuff that we're brainwashed. And these are some of the things that I shed, by the way. It's like the social norms that just don't serve us at all. But I remember I was at dinner one night, you're reading a book, having a glass of wine, like really just feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made this happen for myself. And the bartender was like, look at you living your best life. And I was like, totally, like, I wish I'd discovered this sooner. One of the things that was, there were so many lessons learned from my sabbatical, which I know you too, it's just is like ripe with so many realizations. But one of the things that I learned in action was that my sense is loneliness. So there were times that I felt loneliness, suffered through loneliness in my life. And I thought it was because maybe I wasn't in a relationship. I thought it was something external that I was missing that I needed to complete me. But what came out of my travel sabbatical was this knowledge that when I was connected to my true self, that dissipated the loneliness, that so much of my loneliness had nothing to do with, there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. And I learned that through my sabbatical experience. And that's something that I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, I thought about it as like loneliness versus solitude. So if you see like an eagle kind of circling above, you're not like, what a loser, that guy's all by himself up there. There's like this like majestic solitude to it. So okay, so you had the healing and restorative part, and then like intermixed between that, you were then kind of exploring the coaching practice. What else was going on? Your sister traveled with you for a bit, but what happened next?
So I was in Europe for about 3 months, came back to LA, and that's when I worked for the startup as a consultant. And then I launched my coaching business the summer of 2019. And do you mean what's been going since then, or more information?
No, just kind of like as you were integrating the lessons at the end of your sabbatical, like how did that feel? And
yeah, totally. So I came back to LA, and before I started working for the startup, I was kind of continuing my sabbatical, but in LA. And I'm really grateful for that too. I joked I was a faux lady of leisure because I wasn't independently wealthy or anything. This is my hard-earned savings. But I would continue to do the things like go to dinner by myself, go to museums. I started painting and I was writing, and I was trying to, and the interesting thing too that was somewhat unexpected, I mean, I don't know if I identified as a huge TV person before my sabbatical, but through my sabbatical, I like stopped watching TV. Like I just started shedding these things that weren't really serving me. And so I had this really beautiful chapter when I came back from my sabbatical, and I was in LA a couple months or so, where I was able to just continue those lessons from the sabbatical. Again, there were moments where I was like, what the hell am I doing with my life? And like, just these, like a toggling, like it was like going from everything's great to like, oh my God, this is crazy. But one of the things that I kind of joke about a little bit is we have this idea of a midlife crisis. And when I was younger, you know, there's these stereotypes of people like buying sports cars and like being reckless and whatever. But what I came to understand in myself, at least, is that I want to do something of a midlife awakening. And I really attribute that to the sabbatical and to the lessons learned, and to that shedding the things that weren't serving me and stepping more and more into my true self. I did have a cool experience after the sabbatical ended. I'm trying to remember the timing of things. It was that spring. I went to an in-person retreat with the Martha Beck coaching program. And a feature of that is Equus coaching, which I had never done before. It's coaching through horses at like a stable. I love horses. I grew up horseback riding, and I had never known that this was even a thing. And I had this really, really powerful equus coaching. I was coached by a master coach through the Martha Beck program. And through this experience with the horse, I got really emotional at one point, and she was like, "What's going on? What are the tears?" And it just came out of me. I was like, I really want to shed the things that are no longer serving me. I want to reclaim my inner voice and like live a life that's true to me. And I don't know what happened that day, but it was like all this stuff lifted. And from that point forward, I was able to so much more effortlessly step into that place.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've never heard of that. But I mean, it strikes me that the experiences that a lot of folks have in nature would also, you're not imagining that a rock is second guessing itself. And I'm sure it's the same perspective with a horse.
Yeah, I mean, nature, there's a reason why like Thoreau had Walden Pond, and there's so much in nature that I think is a really incredible piece of a sabbatical if we were able to do it. And for me, it was a big part of my sabbatical in Europe and back in LA, but just spending time in nature and being at peace in it, and just being in the moment. Like one of the things that came out of this chapter for me was being able to walk down the street and like notice a flower blooming and smell it and enjoy it, and just being in the moment was such a gift that I got out of the travel sabbatical experience.
Talk to me about some of the hard times. So I think this is a thing that everyone I've talked to who's been on sabbatical has experienced, but it's hard to imagine going into it that taking a bunch of time off would be tough. What were some of the hard times during your sabbatical, and how'd you get through them?
Yeah, so it's kind of related to what we're going through collectively through this global pandemic. This fact that humans like to cling to the illusion of control, but we don't have control over a lot of things. And there's been a lot of talk of this liminal stage we're in collectively, which refers to we've left a familiar shoreline. We're in the midst of the ocean. We can't see the next shoreline. We have a sense it's there, but we don't know what it looks like or when we'll get there. And that is something I went through with my sabbatical, was just in that time period of knowing there'd be a next shoreline, but not knowing what it looked like or when it would happen. I mean, so many times in life when we're facing a big change or a decision, we think, oh, if only I cross a wall, then it would give me a sense of safety to know, okay, great, I got this new job and it's starting on this date and I can just be free and enjoy myself. But that's not the way life works a lot of times. And so those dark times, the hard times, were when my fear kind of got the worst of me, and I would get agitated around what am I doing and how is this going to work out and is this going to work out, and it was an invitation really to myself to reflect on all the times in my life that I had been in a liminal stage and come out on the other side, and there's all these sayings and cliches and expressions around out of hard times, out of darkness comes light and whatever, but there's a reason for them. And it is true that I believe that for many of us, our lives are maybe more cyclical or spiral than linear. I think we're raised to think that we just have this linear progression and it's smooth sailing and it goes up and up and up. And if anything doesn't feel on that set track, something's wrong, or it's something to question. But I actually think it's natural to have detours and spirals and cycles and different things happening. And so when I went through those hard times in my sabbatical, it was a reminder of those times that had happened before, that when I really flew out, my wings unfolded. Like when we take those leaps, our wings unfold, and we need to have maybe several of those experiences to then really trust in ourselves. My wings aren't going to let me down. Like, when have I ever failed before? When have I ever not figured something out? And so that kind of kept me going through it.
Yeah, I want to flag the concept of a detour in our life and career for when I ask you to put on your career coach hat, which is coming up pretty soon. But are there any things looking back at your time off, how you structured it, what you did that you wish you could have done differently, or things that learnings that you kind of won over the course of the sabbatical that you tell folks?
We've already covered a few of the key learnings. I'm kind of the belief that everything happens for a reason, and maybe it's just a way to justify things, even if they didn't go well. But I wouldn't change anything with my sabbatical just because it led me to this moment. And I mean, sure, maybe like I mean, I can think back and wish I didn't come back when I did, because I did feel in me I could have kept going. And it was actually interesting. The reason I came back was that I was a finalist for an opportunity with a company in LA. And so I came back for the in-person interview, and I ended up getting the offer, actually, even though in my gut, I was like, I don't know if this is the right fit. I didn't listen to my intuition, and they actually reneged on the offer, which has never happened to me before. I didn't even know that was a thing. It was like a startup, so I guess it's not that surprising. So in hindsight, I might think, oh, I wish I kept going and didn't come back for that process. But even through that process, I continued to learn more about what was important to me for my next career chapter, and trusting my instincts and trusting my intuition. I think, there's all this talk in the spiritual world about the universe sending us lessons until we learn them. And for me, learning to trust my intuition, it's an ongoing process. It may be a lifelong journey, but it's gotten so much stronger. And through the sabbatical, that was one of the big takeaways for me, was just trusting in its little things. It can be like, I don't know if I want to walk down that alley. Maybe I'll go down this street instead. Or this person seems interesting that I just randomly sat down next to. Maybe I'll strike up a conversation. And then as it turns out, we'll be friends for like years. Like there are all these little glimmers of our intuition that present itself to us. And that was one of the great things about my sabbatical, was stepping into that more and more.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, so it sounds like you then took a job, and then, within some sort of like small amount of time later, you decided to launch the coaching business, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that was part of the journey? And like, did you know that you should have like ultimately done the coaching thing, but you were like held back, or you're like super excited about the job? What happened?
Yeah, I had to have that experience to understand that because I had thought, okay, if I can do a more traditional role with creativity, then I'll be fulfilled. Then I won't feel like anything's missing anymore. Then I'll be happy and move forward. But what I learned through that experience was that I can work at an awesome company with an amazing founder and be activated intellectually and in a lot of different ways, but that it wasn't fully syncing with my passions and my deeper purpose. Like, maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but because I had questions in a lot of times in my career, I saw a career coach at one point, and we talked a lot about purpose. And I thought I could take that, like, get stuff done, grind mentality to figuring out my purpose. And I was like, yes, let's figure out my purpose. What is my purpose? And I was like, I was like taking all these assessments and like Myers-Briggs and all this stuff. And like, surprise, surprise, like that's not how, at least for me, that's not how my purpose unfolded. The way my purpose was unfolded was through this winding, maybe detour, maybe not, path that I decided to take of trusting my intuition more, restoring the essence of who I am, and thinking back on my life, like I knew self-actualization, maximizing my potential, like really excited me, but yet it seemed so obvious. It just hadn't occurred to me that that was my purpose, to help other people self-actualize. And there were all these other clues that I had kind of just not taken seriously. Like, for example, I mentioned I did a Martha Beck retreat. I think it was in 2015. And when I enrolled in the coaching program in 2018, I was looking for an email, and I realized I emailed them in 2015 and asked about enrolling in their coaching program. And I didn't even remember doing that. It was like there were all these little whispers and clues that coaching is the way I would ultimately go. But I needed to have all of those experiences in the meantime to fully step into coaching and shed my old identity around work as a lawyer and as a chief of staff.
Yeah. No, I think that to your point about a spiral or zigzaggy career in life, I think that another thing that people expect is that, they go on sabbatical and they're going to have some huge change afterwards. I don't think that needs to happen. And also I think it's kind of like the lessons unfold over time. So I've talked to some folks who like way overcorrected on like, okay, mission is like the most important thing. And then they didn't actually like think about whether they liked working with the people, or like the geography was wrong or something like that. So I do think it like starts a chain of reactions. It's not like the finished product.
Yeah, such a theme is trusting the unfolding and planting seeds, and again, just we don't have crystal balls. We don't know how it's all going to work out, but it does tend to happen that one day we reflect back and think, oh, I can connect all the dots, like the constellations of my life make sense now with this perspective. But in the moment, you just see a zillion stars. You don't realize how they're all going to connect one day.
Yeah, Jenna, we've got a question in here. It says, you mentioned your type A workaholic pre-sabbatical personality. How did your sabbatical help inform and allow you to employ a balanced work-life structure post-sabbatical and to coach others on workaholism and balance?
Yeah.
I'd like to add, like, is the Jenna that we see now, is that how you showed up at work at that startup post-sabbatical, or have you kind of like lived into that?
First of all, this is like comical. I showed up at that startup coming as like a political appointee, DC suits. Like I knew people at startups didn't wear suits, but I wore like a blazer every day and like capris and kitten heels, and people were just like, who are you and what are you doing? And I had thought, coming from government to the private sector and a startup, that, you know, government's known to be slow and all this stuff. And so I kind of had thought, you know, private sector best and brightest, like I need to be on. And I like overcompensated. I think people were like, whoa, slow your roll. Like they said I had like this intensity to me sometimes. And so this is not maybe, I mean, I think in times I was like this at the startup, but when we were in stressful times, I probably was a bit agitated and like, I just feel like I was like exuding like stress. But some people commented for me that I think it's like the duck, where below the surface the legs are like spinning, but above the surface you're calm and collected. In me, I was feeling very stressed, but out externally, maybe it was similar. But the way that I took those lessons of shifting my boundaries around work with me is it really was extreme to go from like so much of my life was work to then so much of my life there was no work. And I think I just became very protective of it because I knew it healed me and it served me to be able to have those outlets in my life. And I'm so protective of it now. It's an unstructured time is something I hadn't appreciated before my sabbatical. At work, it was back to back to back meetings and calls and craziness. And then, you know, I'd turn on my laptop and work into the night. But even when I had free time, I was seeing friends, I was doing shows, I just was go, go, go. And it's actually been something that I've stepped more into in this pandemic is solitude, and really appreciating how important it is to rest and restore. And one of the biggest takeaways from these years since that startup phase was just the importance of how we frame things, that we're so socialized to see work and as productive, and we see taking a nap or reading or something that's in the self-care category as like lame or not productive. Like my days, there are days now sometimes on the weekend where all I do is self-care stuff. Like I'll like meditate, do yoga, read, take a nap, go for a run. Like it's just like nothing productive. And I love that. And I tell my younger voice would have said I didn't get anything done today, but my voice today is I had such an amazing day. Like I was so productive for me. So that's been one of the things, but it's hard, you know, it's really hard to make those shifts. And one of the biggest takeaways too is the importance of prioritization. Like we only have a certain number of hours of the day, and being honest about how we spend our time and what we choose to do versus what we have to do. A lot of times we're like, I have to. And when we say I have to, it just like brings down our energy and is draining. But when we say I choose to, and when we're intentional about how we craft our time, it can feel more empowering, like we're in the driver's seat with that.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to have you remove your personal sabbatical hat and put your coaching hat on.
Okay.
What would you say to folks who are contemplating taking a sabbatical?
Wow, it's a big one. I would say if you can, to try to get into a quiet space where you can be reflective, whether that's with a coach or a therapist or just on your own. If you exercise, that can be a moment when things start to bubble up. If you journal or meditate, just carving out time away from the busy and asking yourself questions around where is this yearning coming from, and allowing those whispers to surface. And if you have a voice that's like, that's not practical or that's not realistic, or, you know, just to listen to that, but to allow, it's kind of with compassion, push those away and get more into where is this yearning coming from. I think fear is a huge factor with this. With any time we make a change, there's fear. If you don't have fear, I'd say something's probably wrong. And so knowing you're going to have fear, but not pushing the fear away or numbing or distracting from it, but getting curious about the fear. Like, is it fear of failure, or is it fear of not knowing the answers, or is it fear of being still with things that maybe I've been avoiding, or fear of facing truths that I don't love my job, or I don't love my career, or maybe just, maybe you love your job and you're burnt out, or you're wanting a break and you're like, I want to craft a life that is fully aligned with me and my potential. What will that look like? If I could wave a wand, if I take this sabbatical, what are some of the things I want to bring into it? And then what do I want my job to look like? And who do I want to be when I show up at that job? And you can do like visionings of your future self, which can be interesting, like imagining yourself a year from now, you've completed your sabbatical, you're financially secure, what does your life look like? And that kind of thing can be interesting to delve into.
And what do you think are the most common kind of objections that people have and give themselves, and how do you overcome those?
The objections with taking a sabbatical?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, I was super freaked out about having a gap on my resume, which now I look back on it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that kept me from leaving. The truth is, first of all, it's not a gap. It's a really important chapter of your life. And I remember a wise friend said to me at the time of just being concerned about leaving the startup and not having a job lined up and what would prospective employers say. And she was like, Gena, if you share your experience with a prospective employer and they don't see that as a positive, do you want to work for them? And that was like all I needed for permission. So the permission piece is huge. It's giving yourself permission to step into some of these things. So with the job stuff, honestly, I found I've coached a lot of clients who have taken sabbaticals, and in my own experience, if you know your why of why you're taking it and you're able to frame the experience such that I chose the sabbatical to work on X, Y, or Z, or because I wanted to achieve this, or I wanted to show up at work this way, or whatever it might be, people are excited about it. In all the interviews I did, everyone said, oh my God, I'm so jealous. Tell me more. I want to hear more about that. It was actually a positive. And now that we're seeing this great resignation, and I think we'll see the great sabbatical chapter, I think it's becoming more and more common. You'll see people have sabbatical on their LinkedIn pages, on their resumes. I think there's going to be more of an awareness around what this is. I'll also add, I was unemployed. I remember thinking, I can't say I took a sabbatical because I'm not a professor. This isn't a paid sabbatical. Like, I called it my travel sabbatical, my trav bat, as like a joke, and it made me feel a little bit better about it. But I say a sabbatical is what you want it to be, and it's totally fine to say you're doing a sabbatical, even if you're not working or not paid or whatever it might look like.
Yeah. I like to say that like one of the goals for the sabbatical project and me personally is just to eradicate the term sabbatical.
Okay.
Just because I think it's, the folks who I thought did it in the most confident way, the most authentic way, were like, yeah, I didn't call it sabbatical. I wanted to do these things for myself. And so I did them. So I do think it's this really helpful kind of crutch that we use to say, like, I'm doing something prestigious, like, this is a defined thing. Whereas I think as you said, taking off and just like seeing if your wings unfold is definitely the most kind of courageous and I think authentic way to do it. But it's helpful that we have this, tool and terminology.
Totally. And I've worked with a lot of people who took a break from work for an extended period or quit their jobs in this pandemic, and they're not traveling, and they're like, I'm like doing a staycation, and it doesn't matter. It's restoring yourself. We live in a society where we recognize the signs of burnout once we're already burnt out, and that's serious. Like, there's health impact. We're seeing it from the pandemic itself, and then also from the nature of a lot of jobs. It's like a double whammy of burnout. And so to take time for yourself to boost your well-being, studies upon studies, DJ, or the expert on this, they all show that your productivity is increased, your performance is increased, your clarity is increased. There's so much positive that comes out of, if you want to say, taking a break. instead of a sabbatical.
I'll use it until we don't have to.
Okay, I like that. Until you coin a new phrase.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a question from Jess, who I believe is a coach, and Jess is asking, what advice do you give people who have financial fear, or when taking time off or considering a change?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's real. I mean, not many of us are privileged to have independent sources of income, and we're cobbling stuff together. I would coach people through understanding what they need to feel supported financially and building some bridges if necessary, whether that means taking on a side gig or having a plan for returning to an office or whatever it might be. Just what do you need to feel supported in this financially? I also work with clients on beliefs around finances, and there are people out there who have sufficient savings to do something like this, and they just have been led to believe that it's not a good use of their money. And honestly, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, that was one of my barriers too, was like, it feels frivolous to spend all this money on traveling. Like, I just was like, I've been saving this money since I was like 15. Like, but there's no better, I'd say there was no better use of those resources for me. And another dynamic, which you're, Jess, are probably familiar with as a coach, is this dynamic of abundance versus scarcity. And we as humans tend to just grip this scarcity mindset that there's not enough resources, there's not jobs, there's not money. We live in panic around running out of things, when in effect, a lot of times it is a state of abundance. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to delve into around mindsets. And but ultimately, it's what do you need to feel safe and supported, and how can you get there using your own resources and skills and tools.
Yeah.
And communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I think some people do like fundraisers and GoFundMe's, and there's a lot of creative ways to help in these situations.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about it as like a, like a wedding gift. People will be like, buy me this rafting trip in Zimbabwe or something. I bet you'd have a lot of support if you put yourself out there. But again, that's putting yourself in this vulnerable place where you're doing something that's different, and it's a detour or a spiral or whatnot. And so that's scary for folks.
Yeah, I'm so glad, if I can take a moment, I'm so glad you mentioned vulnerability. I can't believe I haven't mentioned that sooner. I'm obsessed with Brene Brown and all things vulnerability, and developing a relationship with vulnerability is such a huge part of something like this, because you're showing up in a more authentic space, you're taking risks, you're being brave, you're being courageous, you're stepping outside of your comfort zone. And so it's a huge thing, a huge opportunity to develop more comfort with vulnerability.
Yeah. Just quick timeout, public service announcement. Folks who are joining, if you have questions, put them in the comments. I'm looking at them, and we'll address them. So thank you for coming. To your point about, like how kind of safe you feel with your savings and things like that, I think I've also heard it described as an investment. So like, Tim Ferriss talked about, instead of like paying for an MBA program, like putting $200K or something into his travels and then angel investments and things like that. And then for the fear mongering among us, talking about it as like an insurance policy against regret. Right.
Yeah,
so I was in doing some research. I reached out to a friend and found out that there's a 10% chance at age 35 that you don't make it to retirement, just actuarial tables wise. And so, I mean, you hear so many stories about like, I'll do that for retirement, or, my so-and-so waited until their retirement and then they had a catastrophic illness and couldn't do the things they wanted to do. So I think it's like investment, like insurance, different ways to kind of think about how to spend that money.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I mean, I think a lot of people who gravitate towards sabbaticals are the types who appreciate experiences over material things. I know I identify as that, and my parents instilled in me that sense of appreciation. And we started off with modest beginnings. My dad's an entrepreneur. My mom went back to school to be a clinical psychologist when I think I was around 10. So growing up, money was a little tight, but they always made time for doing domestic road trips and helping us to see wonder in our surroundings and like growing up, as I said, playing outside and stuff. It was like there were these worlds outside of myself. And so I love what you just shared. And I think that's such a great way to frame it, that you can't put a price tag on some of these things. It may not be a material thing, but how could you place a price tag on something that might change your life or bring you back to yourself?
What are some of the learnings from coaching folks that are going to take this time off that you could share?
Some of the things I've already shared around what you need to feel supported and safe through this, and thinking through like community and what you want your day to look like. I think also knowing that the day you turn off your laptop, metaphorically or literally, you might think, yippee, I'm like skipping off into my sabbatical, but there's typically a coming down period, like a dropping down period for a lot of people, especially if you're coming off of a high stress situation. I love the Unlocking Us podcast with Brene Brown and the Nagoski twin sisters. They talk about burnout, and they talk about how a lot of times in life, if it's like completing a project or handing in a paper or finishing a campaign, you think, yay, I'm done, I'm going to be like celebrating, but you like totally crash and your adrenals are like trying to get back to where they were. And so a lot of people end up kind of taking a couple weeks immediately just to do self-care, and like just kind of, they don't feel great. It's not easy. It's kind of like a little bit of a tough bump, and then they step into moving forward from there. And just being intentional about, you're like the conductor of this symphony of your life. Like, what do you want it to look like? What's important for you? And holding yourself accountable. And coaches can be great accountability partners for that. It's one thing to say, I'm going to try to bring these things into my life, but when you have a coach who you know cares about you in a safe space, it's really empowering to show up for that coach and yourself. I have a kind of sassy cat who I was wondering if he was going to make an appearance today.
I was hoping that the cat would make a little bit more extravagant of an appearance, but still got 15 minutes left to do something
okay, great.
crazy.
One quick thing too to answer that question, sorry, I tend to go on tangents, is some clients really benefit from like a goal-oriented approach, thinking through what's important for them to accomplish and what it'll look like. I often work around what you want to feel like, because I think that's an important thing to consider. But it's really a remarkable thing to jot down your yearnings, your desires, and then revisit it over time. Like I have scribbles that I wrote down before I left for my sabbatical, and I forgot I even wrote those things down, and then I go back to them even now, and I'm like, wow, I like really had a clearer sense, and I realized of some of the things that were important to me.
Yeah, you mentioned, so you mentioned a few different resources. Obviously, Eat, Pray, Love, Run, Wake Up Before the Sunrise, Brene Brown. What are some of the resources that, like for someone either preparing to take a sabbatical or like on sabbatical, that you feel like are helpful or they should take a look at?
Let's see. I was listening to Oprah's Super Soul podcast like daily. She is a spiritual guru, which many people don't associate that with her brand, but she's really remarkable, and she has the most phenomenal guests. I was listening to On Being a lot. I was immersing myself too in like poetry and the arts, like those types of podcasts, because that's something I'm personally interested in. I believe too that creativity is a gateway to a more spiritual place in us. And once again, Liz Gilbert, but her book, Big Magic, and The Artist's Way are two books that I sense a lot of SabbaticalLand people enjoy, just ways to delve into our curiosity more. I have a whole bunch of resources, including podcasts, on my website, which is just www and then my name, GenaChieco.com.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll be sure to kind of push out some of these recommendations in the show notes and the comments and things like that. How would you recommend someone bring up the topic of sabbatical to their boss? So they're employed, they're not going to take time off. Do you have any tips about ways to approach that or best practices in talking about it?
Yeah, I'd say first get pretty clear in yourself of what you want it to look like, and once you're clear and grounded and confident in that, then begin to broach those topics. It could be interesting to contemplate if other people at your organization have taken sabbaticals and use them as resources, not to state the obvious, but just you don't need to repeat the wheel, find out what worked, what didn't work. for them. I mean, ultimately, if you've made a decision that this is important to you, then it's time to have that, to have that conversation with your boss and say, for these reasons, I'm interested in taking time off. I'm thinking this many weeks. I'm committed to a smooth transition. You can even talk to your boss when you already have a roadmap of who's going to cover what. I mean, the more prepared you can be, I'd say, the better, because if your boss is confident in you, and your ability to have a smooth transition, then it takes so much stress out of the picture or the equation. If you are your own boss, that's great. That just means a plan for you to have someone step in while you're gone, and the communication around it is important too.
And how about returning to work? So obviously you're talking about how, you adjusted or didn't adjust back to the working world. Is there any like kind of reintegration step help that you'd recommend?
Yeah. Also, just a note on that last question: if you have great resources in HR, they can be great partners for you as you're exploring your options. Coming back, I would definitely recommend a big buffer of time. Like, don't fly in and then like start your back at work the next day. I mean, there's no saying what amount of time works best for you. Only you know that. But I got back in like November and I started working in February. So I had a pretty big chunk of time. I'd say ideally at least 2 weeks for that. And being very gentle with yourself. Transitions are hard, even when we're excited about them. That's just human nature. And so knowing that you might need extra care and support during that time. And I think a lot of people experience, DJ, I don't know if you experienced this, but like this kind of, you might be homesick a little. You're excited to see friends. You're excited to get back to the comfort of your familiar surroundings. And you're excited at first, but then it kind of starts to fade away. And you're like, oh, I'm back. And like, this is my life. And just kind of some questions and churn around that. So that's why I brought so much of my sabbatical approach to my daily life when I was back in LA, but just like holding space for whatever might surface for you and whatever it looks like is important.
Do you have any advice on what folks should not do on their sabbatical? Like practices or, like ways to think about it that you see folks kind of heading the wrong direction?
I mean, I tend to shy away from shoulds, but I would say, being a former type A person, I think the beauty of the sabbatical is not approaching it like a work project with like deliverables and KPIs and like grinding it out. Like for me, if I had tried to set goals, like if I had started out my sabbatical and said, I'm going to learn to love running and I'm going to go running every day and I'm going to run like 10 miles, I'd be like, no way, I'm not doing that. It just like unfolded in me naturally. So I think holding space for the unfolding is important, and not trying to grind stuff out or, maybe it works for some people where they're like a performing artist and they're like, I'm going to take my sabbatical to become like next level, like great. But I think for a lot of us, it's more about just the quiet invitations back to ourselves. I'll add one of the things I'm just thinking of now that was such a gift of the sabbatical was that I went through a nomadic phase even predating the sabbatical, but especially during that backpacking trip, all I had was a backpack of my belongings. And there was a time in my life where I wouldn't have enjoyed that, but I loved it. And I found that I was going through this phase where I was like shedding a lot of things. And what I came away with was this homecoming to myself, that what I experienced through the sabbatical and ever since is I can be anywhere and feel a sense of home in myself. And I think that's the beauty of a sabbatical when you're approaching it, is like, how do I come home to who I truly am? What have I neglected in my life? And take it from there.
Yeah, no, I like that. Okay, last few minutes here. Lightning round. No, just one more question, and then I want to talk about what you'd like to talk about in the cohort class. So, from a personal basis, like, have you plotted your next sabbatical? Do you have an idea of how long you'll need to take, how long you'll need to wait? Or are you letting it bubble up?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I started my coaching business in 2019 and I did not travel at all. I was super frugal. I joked that my finances had Benjamin Buttons, but I was never happier. And my idea was I'm going to go crazy in 2020. And I had a big trip planned the summer of 2020, including the Camino de Santiago Trail and an artist residency in France and like breathwork retreat in Majorca, like all this stuff. And of course, that all was canceled. And it's interesting, out of this pandemic, I've really begun nesting, and I haven't traveled at all, and or barely. So I am dreaming big for 2022. I'd like to take a trip abroad. I'm not sure yet what it will look like, and probably not 3 months, maybe a month is realistic for me at that point. We'll see.
Is there space, like, will you continue to make space for those bigger chunks, or have you found like a rhythm where you feel like you can take a plus-sized American vacation, but not a full sabbatical?
I have no doubt I will take a long sabbatical at some point in my life. Right now, I'm loving my life and my work so much that I don't have that same yearning to go off the grid. But I think for sure I'll do American vacations are ridiculous. It's like a week here, a week there, and that's it. So I'll definitely do like a month here, a month there, and ultimately interspersed with some larger trips as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So in the last few minutes, folks, feel free to chime in and ask questions. But what are you planning on teaching during your kind of like segment of the cohort course?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to delve into more of the inner journey, some of the things that we've touched upon, shedding things that aren't serving us, including fear, and kind of excavating out the deeper yearnings, giving ourselves permission, just understanding what might be going on in our inner lives as we're contemplating these sabbaticals. And I hope to base it on, I participated in a workshop with Elizabeth Gilbert prior to my sabbatical, which allowed me to give myself permission to take that trip. And so I'm hoping to bring some of that to the experience as well.
Nice. And then do you want to give a message to coaches out there? I know that we're building up this kind of like sabbatical specific coaching practice. So I wanted to give you some space to talk about that for a sec.
Yeah, so we are building out a coaching program for the sabbatical project. And right now we are looking for coaches who are interested in doing individual and potentially group coaching, who have been on sabbaticals and ideally have experience coaching clients in SabbaticalLand as well. And if this sounds of interest to you, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website, and I'm happy to share more about it.
Cool. Any parting thoughts?
No, thank you for being a part of this process, and for all of you attendees, whether you're in SabbaticalLand or contemplating it, kudos to you for doing something that might seem unusual, but will undoubtedly have such an incredible impact in your life.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing your story, Gena. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to press the end broadcast button and we'll see what happens.
Okay. Thanks for the adventure.